An elderly St. Petersburg woman disappears in an unexplainable ball of fire. A corpse in a rural Alabama creek is found without its head, hands, heart, or its spleen. A young volunteer vanishes in the Carolina mountains, only to turn up hog-tied and strangled in the backseat of an abandoned car. And a wealthy Georgia couple dies grisly deaths, his headless body dumped in their garage and her body at the bottom of a lake. This collection of true tales from the Gothic South has a single thread running through each: bizarre death scenes that even decades later left investigators scratching their heads with more questions than answers. Welcome to Haunts and Hollows True Tales of the Gothic South. I'm your host, mystery author Liam Ash. In this episode, we'll explore 3 cold cases and 1 medical mystery that are equal parts baffling, terrifying, and macabre. This podcast is sponsored by my good friends at Arca Noctis. They invite you to unlock your curiosity with their collection of the odd, the unusual, and the obscure. Early on the morning of July 2nd, 1951, St. Petersburg landlady Pansy Carpenter made a very uncomfortable discovery. She was delivering a telegram to 67-year-old Mary Reeser, who was a Pennsylvania native. She had just moved to southern Florida after the death of her husband, Dr. Richard Reeser, in 1947. Pansy knocked a few times but didn't get an answer, which gave her a little concern as Mary was usually an early riser. She checked the door handle and got something of a shock. The door was still locked, but the handle was very hot to the touch. Then she noticed a faint smell of smoke and a small soot mark on the wall next to Mary's door. She knocked again, and when that went unanswered, she got a pair of nearby house painters to open the door for her. What they found was one hell of a scene. Mary's favorite armchair was gone. In its place was a pile of ashes. In those ashes, there were a few coil springs, a skull that had shrunk to the size of a teacup, and an unsinged human foot still inside a black satin bedroom slipper. That was the only trace they could find of Mary Reeser. Curiously, even though the room was stifling hot, there was no smoke to be seen, and even the scent of smoke was surprisingly light throughout the apartment. The police secured the scene and began the grim task of cleaning up. After sifting through the ashes, they found a few more bits of Mary. This included a portion of her backbone and 6 small objects that they thought might be teeth. Even more perplexing was the state of the rest of the room. Any sign of fire was confined to the space immediately around and above where her chair had sat. Candles in a nearby electrical socket had melted, but stacks of newspapers and the sheets on a daybed which sat on either side of the chair were completely unburned. It appeared as though the fire had been incredibly intense, but also remarkably brief. One scientist theorized that the heat would have had to have reached 3,000 degrees to be hot enough to incinerate human bone into ash. Dr. William Krogman from the University of Pennsylvania claimed the scene left him confused. In his own words, "Never have I seen a human skull shrunk by intense heat. In fact, the opposite has always been true. The skulls have virtually exploded into hundreds of pieces." The local police, coroner, and fire marshal conducted their own investigation, but they were left scratching their collective heads. There were no sound theories except one letter from an anonymous witness who claimed to have seen a great ball of fire fly into the apartment window from the sky. So a box containing the remnants of Mary was sent to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, along with a letter politely requesting their help. Those experts labeled her death a result of what's known as the wick effect, and that's what most of us would call spontaneous human combustion. Mary was known to smoke and take sleeping pills, usually at the same time, and that was not a good mix. She takes the pills, lights up a cigarette, and falls asleep. The cigarette lights her acetate nightgown, which starts the blaze. And once her body starts to burn, there was enough fat in the 170-pound woman to keep that fire burning until the human candle simply melted away. It's a scientific-sounding solution to a bizarre death scene, and one that's not as unusual as you might think. Experts have collected more than 200 credible reports of spontaneous human combustion over the past 300 years. This includes Ireland's Margaret Hogan in 1970, Beatrice Oskey in Illinois in 1979, and 73-year-old Henry Thomas of South Wales, who disappeared along with half of his favorite chair. All that remained was his skull and both legs just below the knees. On April 15, 1997, a father and his two sons made a horrifying discovery while hiking the dry Cotico Creek bed off Eagle Rock Road just outside Arab, Alabama. It was a corpse. Well, it was most of it at least. The man, and they assumed it was a man, was dressed in a faded glory short-sleeve pullover and a pair of Levi's jeans. That was all they could gather from the scene. The body was missing its head, its hands, and its feet. The victim's corpse was soaked in blood, and someone had taken the time to toss a few air fresheners around the scene, just in case. Investigators were called, and what they uncovered left them scrambling for answers. They estimated the victim to be between 20 and 30 years old. They guessed he was about 5'9" and weighed somewhere around 150 pounds. They thought he might be a strawberry blonde, and that was the easy part. The rest of the crime scene made little to no sense. The body was what police termed moderately decomposed. They suggested that the victim had been shot or stabbed somewhere else, then brought to the remote location for dumping. The head and hands had been removed by what they called some type of saw, and this was likely done to hinder identification of the body. The feet, which had been bound by rope, were actually chewed off by wild animals. Most baffling, the body's heart and spleen had been removed with some degree of surgical skill. According to Chief Investigator Keith Wilson, someone went to great lengths to hide the identity of our victim and the cause of death. And that's because the spleen and the heart, some medical examiners will explain, can hold traces of toxin that can lead to an unnatural death. Authorities dove into the case, but there was very little to work with. Without an identity, they couldn't investigate the life or disappearance of the victim. Several tips did come in from Arab, Alabama locals, and several witnesses claimed to have seen an early 90s model maroon Chevy truck with tinted windows in the same area a few days before the body was found. A white male was said to be the driver, and the same witnesses noted that the man was, quote-unquote, acting nervous. Police developed a composite sketch, but it led to no new suspects in the case. Investigators kept the file open, but over the coming years, the case known as the Alabama torso murder went ice cold. They never stopped searching for new clues and new leads. In 2021, police released an updated image of what they believed the victim might have looked like. They included relevant descriptors such as Scandinavian, light skin, dark blonde or light brown hair, blue eyes, and freckles. And all of this was part of a genetic study done by Parabon Nanolabs out of Virginia. Still, this didn't move the case forward. They finally caught a break in August of 2022. According to one Parabon researcher, with genetic genealogy and SNP testing, we can find second, third, or fourth cousins and beyond, and we can use that information to reverse engineer someone's identity. And they did just that. That summer, they located close family matches for the victim, one in Santa Barbara, California, and one in Madison, Tennessee. Within a few weeks, they had collected DNA samples that turned out to be the victim's parents, who were still alive. This gave the police one critical piece of the puzzle. The headless body of John Doe number 970400317 now had a name: Jeffery Douglas Kimzey, age 20, of Santa Barbara. While this answer was a huge step forward, it left them with even more questions. Why had their victim been killed, and why was his body found more than 2,000 miles from his home? Although he had disappeared more than 26 years earlier, Jeffrey's family had never filed a missing person report. In fact, they were not sure where he was and weren't aware that he had died. In an odd twist, the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Office found an incident report filed on May 8, 1997, several weeks after the body was discovered, listing Kimzey as a possible offender in that case. Investigators claim that this case is not nearly as cold as it once was. With a name, they can now work backwards and try to connect the found body to the man that he once was. They say they have identified persons of interest in the case and are now using the information gathered at the scene. Today, the case remains open and unsolved. If you have any information about Jeffery Douglas Kimzey, contact the Marshall County Sheriff's Office at 256-582-2034. On June 17, 1970, authorities discovered a chilling scene: a young woman's body in North Carolina's Pisgah National Forest. She was found in the backseat of an abandoned gray government-owned sedan. She had been hogtied with a length of nylon rope and strangled. Her pants had been wrapped around her eyes like a blindfold. Local authorities were dumbfounded by the murder scene. Or were they? The victim was soon identified as Nancy Morgan, a volunteer for a national outreach program who had been missing for several days. Nancy had moved from her hometown of Baton Rouge to Madison County, North Carolina, as part of Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, a government group established to help combat poverty. After a year with VISTA, she had planned on attending nursing school. Headlines in the local paper announced her murder, and reporters detailed her last known movements. On June 14th, she had spent her day doing errands and chores, multiple witnesses for that. That night, she had dinner with Jim Adams, a VISTA co-worker. She left his place about 3 a.m. and then simply vanished. The next afternoon, a fellow named Richard Hames tried to reach Nancy to let her know that he had the new tires for her car. On the 16th, he reported her missing. A group of VISTA volunteers decided to go looking for her, and that's when the car with Nancy's body was first discovered. Local authorities got the initial crack at the case, and by all accounts, they fumbled the ball badly. That may be for reasons I'll uncover in a few minutes. Soon, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, and the Madison County Sheriff's Office were all involved in the hunt, but they made virtually no headway in Nancy's murder. That all changed in 1984, when E.Y. Ponder, the local sheriff, was running for re-election. His campaign promise? He was going to solve the young woman's homicide no matter what it took. His solution was simple: charge Nancy's co-worker Jim Adams, since he was the last person to see her alive. His completely unfounded theory? It was a wild sex party gone bad. The sheriff's ace in the hole, now 15 years later, was a new surprise witness. At Jim's trial for the sexual assault and murder of Nancy Morgan, a convicted felon named Johnny Waldrop took the stand. He testified that he had gone to Jim's house on June 15th. There, he saw Nancy dead on the couch. Johnny swore that Jim had threatened his life if he didn't help him move the body, so they placed her in the car and ditched it in the forest. Jim's defense team had a simple rebuttal. Everything Johnny Waldrop was saying was a lie. Sheriff Ponder kept to his guns, and that there was only one possible killer, and that his witness proved it beyond a shadow of a doubt. So it was a case of he said versus he said until, well, she said. And that's when Johnny's mother, Ada, took the stand. She testified that her son had made a deal with the sheriff. Simply put, he had lied to get out of prison. 3 other defense witnesses claimed that Johnny had only testified because he had been threatened with more time behind bars if he didn't. Turns out the sheriff was going to make good on his campaign promise at any cost. It didn't work. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before acquitting Jim Adams of all charges. And it may be small consolation, but Sheriff Ponder was soon voted out of office. At this point, it looked like the case was ice cold. It had gone from an attention-grabbing murder scene to a nearly forgotten footnote in Carolina crime history. That is until a national reporter named Mark Pinsky published his book, Met Her on the Mountain, in 2013. He had been obsessed with the crime for more than 40 years, had conducted hundreds of interviews, and now he wanted to share his theories, and they were explosive. In the book, he lays out the night that Nancy Morgan died. That evening, she had driven past a group of local boys hanging out on the side of the highway, as was their custom. When she drove past in the other direction several hours later, they got to work. According to Mark, the boys had a history of surrounding lone female motorists on the road, boxing them in with their cars, and then sexually assaulting them. From his interviews, he learned that the women were too scared to press charges because one of these boys was Richard Johnson, the son of local police chief and Sheriff Ponder friend Leroy Johnson. He posits they forced her car off the road, abducted her, and took her to a few different spots to assault her. Mark says the men hogtied their victim to keep her from escaping. When she struggled against the ropes, she was strangled. The men discovered her dead body, panicked, drove her and her car back to the National Forest, and abandoned her. According to other witness interviews, when Nancy was reported missing, Sheriff Ponder even called Richard Johnson and said, "If you guys have that girl, you better turn her loose." Mark Pinsky claims that Richard confessed all of this to him when the author visited him in prison. Richard was serving time for murdering his own 5-year-old daughter. He confessed to being part of the kidnapping, but denied any involvement in her sexual assault or murder. To date, state investigators have not made any other arrests. They claim they plan on retesting some of the evidence in the case, but they won't provide a timeline or other details. So now, more than 50 years later, Nancy Morgan's murder remains a mystery. This last case threw a wealthy southern mountain town into a blind panic. The cliché is that murders just don't happen in a community like this, and a murder like this one, that shouldn't happen anywhere. The community in question was Great Waters Reynolds, an upper-crust gated neighborhood alongside Lake Oconee about 12 miles northeast of Eatonton, Georgia. Two longtime residents, Russell and Shirley Dermond, had settled there after several years in the fast food franchise game. It turns out that owning several Hardys is good for the bank account. Of course, the Dermond clan had also had their share of tragedy. In 2000, the couple's oldest son, Mark, was murdered in Atlanta while purchasing crack cocaine. Even that, though, could not prepare the family for what they were about to face. On Thursday, May 1st, 2014, Russell was seen by several people running errands in town. Later in the afternoon, he and the missus spoke to another son, Brad, over the phone. Then, nothing. That weekend, they were expected at a friend's Kentucky Derby party. When they were no-shows, their friends grew worried. Phone calls were made, but none were returned. Finally, on Tuesday, May 6th, one neighbor went to the couple's home and found the front door unlocked. A search of the house turned up nothing. No Russell and no Shirley. When they searched the garage, they found more than they could have ever bargained for. A body they assumed to belong to Russell Dermond was lying on the floor in a small pool of blood. They had to assume it was Russell, as the body didn't have a head. Still, there was no sign of Shirley. Police cordoned off the house as a crime scene while the family waited on edge for what they assumed would be contact from kidnappers. That call never came. The police did what the police do, and they searched the house. Nothing of value seemed to have been stolen. They questioned the couple's 3 remaining children, and they found nothing that would suggest that they were in any way involved. And they couldn't find a link between what had just happened and the earlier death of son Mark. Investigators admitted that the most baffling thing about this case was early on there were virtually no clues. Despite the savage nature of Russell's death, they had almost nothing to go on. There were no signs of a break-in, no signs of a struggle, no surveillance or security video, and nothing taken. The only thing police found was a bit of gunpowder on the dead man's collar. That, they claim, suggests that Richard was shot and his head was taken to prevent the bullet from being recovered. That implies that the crooks, and they think there was more than one, knew exactly what they were doing. The police did get a second clue 10 days later when a fisherman stumbled across the dead body of Shirley Dermond while boating on Lake Oconee. She had been weighted down with several cement blocks tied with parachute cords, but she ultimately found her way back to the surface. The coroner indicates she was likely killed with several blunt force blows to the head. Now, 12 years later, what started as a baffling crime scene has only grown more opaque. There are theories that perhaps Russell was involved in business dealings that he shouldn't have, or that the couple had witnessed something they shouldn't have. Others say that it might have been a robbery or a kidnapping attempt gone very, very wrong. In the interim, police continued to work on any available leads. In 2014, they sent some trace DNA from the victim's shirt to a specialized lab for testing. Those results remain inconclusive. For now, the answers they are looking for, like one victim's head, remain somewhere out of sight, waiting for that one clue or one lead to break the case wide open. If you have any information, call the FBI's Atlanta field office at 770-216-3000 or the Putnam County Sheriff's Office at 706-485-8557. Next up on Haunts and Hollows True Tales of the Gothic South, we'll take a deep dive into serial killers who kept their counts climbing even from behind bars. This includes one psychopath with more than a dozen bodies on his scorecard who took out another inmate in a way no one could ever have imagined. If you're looking for more Southern folk legends and true crime mysteries, don't just look, hit subscribe, and that way my next story finds you. A new episode drops every other week, each one dredging up the places, the people, the customs, and the sins that the South would rather keep buried. Want to go even deeper? Every story comes with its own research file with the sources, the photos, and the threads that I pulled while chasing it down. Sign up for my newsletter and I'll send you a copy free. You'll find the newsletter, my latest episodes, and the full schedule of cons and events that I attend all around the South at hauntsandhollows.com. Until then, safe travels, and maybe keep that porch light burning before you turn in.